have just a whole bunch of regulars who tune in every time. So good to see you all.
This is my favorite part, seeing where people's from. Yeah, I do these on my trainings as well.
What does that mean in the Midlands, Judith? I'm going to unmute you. I think you just have to accept the unmute. Oh, there it is.
Literally in the middle of England, not Wales and Scotland, just England. It's just south of Leicester.
Okay. Why? So it's just in the middle. That's why it's called the Midlands?
That's why it's called the Midlands.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for joining all the way from England. Cool. So we do have everyone on mute, but we encourage and we want you all to, and it seems like a lot of you know the drill, to put your questions and comments in the chat, which you can find by scrolling over to the bottom of your screen and clicking the chat button. And then typing your questions and comments while we're doing this. And then Jenna will call on you to unmute you, which you have to accept that unmute on your side. And then you can share your question or comment with the group. And so if you want to turn on your video, or you can turn on your video, we welcome you to, but no pressure. And we're so glad that you're here, whether you join by video or audio, or whether you're just kind of listening in and have it on at work. We love that. And we'll get started in just a minute. Janie, I'm looking at the Amazon page for your book, and I just love all the mountainscape artwork for your book and all the different visuals. It's so beautiful.
Yes, again, a shout out to North Atlantic for bringing that vision into reality.
Great design does a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I would be curious to hear from everyone in the chat if this is your first time joining for A Better Normal, or your second time, or your 45th time if you're Adriana. How many? And if it's your first time, let us know how you heard about this event. Several, fifth, first. Yeah, let us know in the chat how you heard about it. 10th, wow, welcome back, Maxine. Via email, founder of your organization. Cool, oh, thanks for joining, Dale. First time a friend told me about it. Word of mouth. Okay, awesome. So some of you are getting our newsletter, great. We do invite you all to join ACES Connection, and to do that, you just go to acesconnection.com and click the join button. And we are working to create a trauma-informed society all over the world. In fact, Adriana just started a community for New Zealand. Yeah, and I'm the community facilitator for the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. So if, oh, you know what, Jenna, remember that one time you compiled that list? Do you have that handy of all the communities by region and type? If you have it handy, if you want to drop that in there. And that way you can see if there's a community in your area, or if there's an interest community. So, and if there isn't a community in your area, but you want to start one, and you are in the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic, then you want to reach out to me. And all of our emails are on the homepage if you forget, but I'll also put mine in here. And then Carrie is also on the call. Do you want to wave, Carrie? And she's our community facilitator for the Southeast. So that's who you want to reach out to. And then Jenna, who is facilitating and doing all the tech and making this call run. She is the one that sends out all the newsletters that you've been getting. So so grateful for all of the amazing work that Jenna does. So thank you so much for facilitating this call. Do we have any other business, Jenna?
I think that's everything.
Okay. Great. So let me introduce you to Dr. Jamie Marich. I'm so excited to have her joining us, and she is joining us from Ohio. And I have been devouring her book, Trauma and the 12 Steps, and I just love it. And so Dr. Jamie Marich is a facilitator of transformative experiences, which I love. And she's a clinical trauma specialist, an expressive artist, a writer, a yogini, a performer, a short filmmaker, a Reiki master, recovery addict. And she unites all of these elements in her work. And that definitely comes out in your work, which is so holistic, so healing. Anything that you want to add to what we should know about you, Jamie?
No, just thank you so very much for having me. I do so many things focused around trauma, and both as a professional clinical counselor and as somebody who works in wellness and recovery. So I'm sure we'll be touching on a lot of those today.
Awesome. So I just kind of wanted to get us rolling, and I'm seeing more familiar faces. This is so great. Yumi, you were on the last one I hosted. Thanks for coming back. You just had such wonderful comments last time. So 12 steps are near and dear to my heart because, and I'm very open about the fact that when I was a teenager, I struggled with addiction to methamphetamine and went to rehab at age 20. And the way that rehab is in the United States is that 12 steps are just what you do. You know, I did a outpatient program through like a public department of behavioral health here in California. And it was pretty good. I'm actually pretty grateful because it was pretty close to free. And I just feel like that people don't always have the resources that we need. And so I feel super grateful. And the 12-step meetings were a big part of recovery, you know, and I was super grateful for them at the time. I definitely remember feeling nervous and uncomfortable first showing up in those rooms, not feeling like I belonged. And you know, so many of us who struggle with substance misuse already are bringing that to the table where we maybe didn't feel exactly like we belonged at home with our families. And that kind of trauma may have led us into substance misuse, and then showing up in these rooms and trying to feel like we belong and fit in. I remember that feeling really hard, but I also remember there being so much warmth and compassion and great stories and feeling like, okay, all right, I'm not alone. And I just remember that being so healing and wonderful, despite some of the more awkward and uncomfortable feelings that I had as well. And later in life, returned to the rooms in Al-Anon meetings, which Al-Anon, along with ACA, to me is kind of like open to almost anyone who feels like there's some dysfunctional members of the family that you need a support group for, and just found such healing and love and support in those rooms. And so I just have such a feeling of awe and respect and love when it comes to 12-step meetings. And then I'm like, but then I also feel that the trauma piece has been such an important part of my healing. Mm-hmm. And it just never came up in the rooms. And if you have kind of like a similar thing that you want to share in the chat, or want to share with the group, like, please put it in the chat. I'd love to hear. I checked in with Carrie about this, and I want to hear Carrie's little story in just a minute. But Jamie, was that kind of your experience too? And tell us a little bit about your inspiration to write this book and why you felt it was needed.
Sure. Well, I had a very unconventional experience in terms of how I was introduced to 12-step recovery. And I had the good fortune of being introduced by a sponsor who was very trauma informed before the word was, or the phrase was well known, because this would have been in the early 2000s. And I think part of what helped is she was a clinical social worker. She did work in the field of addiction, but that's not necessarily a guarantee, because so much of what I address in the book is even the treatment and recovery field can be very lacking in the way of trauma. So to make a very long story short, I struggled with some form of addiction since I was a small child. Food was my first addiction. Self-injury and dissociation, which I do a lot of work with, and its connection to addiction, were definitely responses I had to some childhood trauma that I experienced. And then by the time I went to work on my undergraduate degree, I was pretty well off to the races, as is sometimes said. I did grow up in a very moral model, very religious household where your addiction issues, your alcohol issues were all about being a sin manifestation, and you were weak if you couldn't figure it out or get enough prayer to figure it out. And so I never felt I could have approached my parents or my family with this sense of, hey, I need help, I need treatment. So I did the only thing I really knew how to do, which was run away. And I moved to Europe in the fall of 2000. I packed a backpack and saved, had some money that I had saved. And it wasn't totally random in that my family's from Croatia, which is a country in Eastern Europe, which was part of the former Yugoslavia. And there was a bad civil war there in the early 90s. And so I went there after I finished my undergrad, knowing that I could teach English. And that's essentially what I started doing, was teaching English and working for some aid organizations. And it was through that networking that I met Janet Leff, who became my first sponsor. And I dedicate the book to her. And she was somebody who really epitomized the spirit of what we sometimes call attraction rather than promotion. She never tried to evangelize me. She never tried to shove anything down my throat with recovery. She was just a very nice, good woman who I had a chance to meet through my work in the community. And indeed, the first recovery meeting of any kind I went to, it was not a 12-step meeting, but it was more of a policy type meeting for the county in which we were living in. I went as her translator. As I like to share it, I was not a professional translator by any means, but I was good in a pinch. And she had me come and translate for her. And that's where I started learning about recovery language and what recovery even meant. And so probably a month or two after that, when I was really struggling, because when I moved to Europe, I ended up stopping the use of drugs, but I was still drinking. It was essentially a replacement of addiction. And then I ended up using drugs again and couldn't figure out why. But I knew this woman was somebody who would help give me the explanations. And so I was just very fortunate because she validated not only my addiction as a medical issue that could be treated, that it wasn't just a sin. So much of the 12-step approach is the disease model. And whether or not you like that word disease or not, I think so many of us who are trauma informed are on board with the fact that it's not a moral failing, that it is something that can be addressed. So she not only validated that, but probably another month or so after that initial experience where I shared my life story with her, she validated so many of my experiences and reactions as traumatic. I remember the day very clearly, and because this is an ACEs call, I think a lot of you will resonate with this or have had clients who've resonated with it, that I had a total meltdown at my job. I was primarily working for a Catholic organization. I had a priest as a boss who was a very good man, to be clear. And he said something to me that just, it was a trigger, and it caused me to have a total meltdown. It was regarding a duty I was being asked to do. And he ended up calling Janet as if to say, would you please come and handle her? Because I don't know what's going on. And I was totally in this dissociative meltdown and was crying and just couldn't talk to him. I couldn't really hear anything around me. And she ended up telling him, Father, I got it from here. This isn't a little girl acting out. This is trauma. And that was the first time I had ever heard this is trauma connected to any of my behaviors or whatnot. And so she took me back to the house I was renting and essentially put me to bed with a cold compress on my head and listened as she asked me if this tapped into anything traumatic I may have experienced. And at that point, I had associated trauma only with Vietnam War veterans specifically. I had no education or understanding that it was for all, that really all of us have been traumatized just to various degrees. And she was the first person who really gave me that validation. So when people ask me what my impetus was for writing the Trauma and the 12 Steps book, and really doing this as so much of my clinical work and teaching work, I live for the day where everybody can have an experience like I had with Janet, who was seeking recovery primarily in this world where only 12-step was available to me as a recovery method. I didn't really know there were other choices at the time, so that's what I had. Yet she presented it to me in such a way where I was sold. Like I liked 12-step spirituality. I resonated with a lot of the concepts of the program. And then when I ended up moving back to the US to do grad school a few years later, yes, I was shocked and repulsed by what I saw going on, not just at a lot of meetings, but at a lot of treatment centers. And so like what you shared in your experience, Alison, is not surprising to me at all. And I do think that is the unfortunate truth. And I think I've just been so fueled from this place of, I know how it can be when people come in and are treated very sensitively and also have their trauma validated. So much of the work I've done, both personally and professionally, has been trying to bridge the gap between the two worlds, because I did go on to get a master's in counseling after I got sober. Part of that was getting into my own deeply focused trauma therapy when I was working on my graduate degree. And there's so much that the field of mental health and trauma has given us, but they often are alienated or don't want to hear about 12 steps or kind of the rehab models, which can be very flawed, to be clear. But I do think that there's a lot of wisdom that can be shared between the two fields, between the two philosophies. And so I've long sought through my career to try to bridge the gap. You're muted, Alison.
Was there, thank you so much for sharing that. Was there a point at which you thought, I just have to write this book, it's just so needed? And like how did that come about?
Yeah, so there's actually a first edition of this book that came out in 2012. So the version that's out this year is the revised and expanded that North Atlantic put out. But I remember it was about 2010. That's when I had first started giving continuing education courses with any kind of regularity, because I had done some work before 2010. But 2010 is when I started teaching nationally. And the company I was working with was really kind of putting me out there as this young and up and coming voice in trauma, because even at that point, I'd already won a pretty major award in the EMDR community, and my dissertation was published pretty significantly. So yeah, it was nice to kind of be put out there as a quote unquote younger expert in the field, if you will. And in teaching a lot of courses just on the basics of trauma or the basics of EMDR or the basics of trauma and addiction, I would share a lot of what I shared with you, my beliefs that 12 steps still has a place, yet we have to be a lot more trauma informed in how we deliver it. And I shared a little of my story. And at that point, other professionals primarily came up to me saying, thank you for not disparaging the 12 steps, because a lot of people in our fields, in our professional fields, have had a life-changing experience through 12-step recovery. I mean, I'm one of those people who credit the 12 steps. And then we have a lot of our folks in the trauma field who just downright put down 12-step recovery. And I don't think that's fair, because yes, I am the first to admit that 12 steps, especially how treatment centers can kind of treat them as like, this is what we do and we don't offer you anything else. That is a problem. And there are problems with how the 12 steps are delivered, but I have never been convinced the answer is to throw them out. That wouldn't have worked for me, because I still work the 12 steps in concert with a lot. So I think that the message I conveyed was very hopeful and validating to a lot of professionals who liked the 12 steps because of their own experiences, but felt a lot of these big names in trauma were kind of putting down 12-step recovery. So make a long story short, getting that feedback from professionals that you have this way about you where you can bridge these worlds is really unique, and we thank you for it. It was hearing those kinds of comments that I knew I had to put this into book form. And that is what brought about the first edition in 2012. And then the tide has kept coming with people connecting with this work. And now we are here with the revised and the expanded edition.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for explaining that. Yeah, I just did my Master's of Public Health at Boston University School of Public Health. Actually, Jenna and I were classmates in a couple classes. And continuously in the mental health classes that I took, we talked about the importance of interventions that are available for free and widely available to all. Yeah. And there's almost no intervention that exists that's more accessible than 12-step meetings. And, you know, for people to come in and say they're terrible, they're not trauma informed enough, they don't do this, they don't do that. It's like, to me, it comes off as so elitist.
Yes.
Because not everyone can afford premium therapy, premium rehabs. I mean, now it almost seems like now there's so many like spa like rehabs, like, you know, go to Malibu for like, you know, and get a spa treatment, but that's just for a couple elite people. And so your book is so refreshing because these meetings have to stay. These meetings are for people, by people, they're free, they're self-organizing. And if there's a way that trauma-informed can make its way into these groups, I'd love to see that.
Yeah. So 2 things I want to just address to that comment. Thank you for talking about the point about accessibility, availability, and that, yeah, there could certainly be an elitism in our fields. I mean, I think one of the great injustices of our time is that professional treatment is not equitably available. You know, it's not. And
heartbreaking.
You know, it's probably a whole other soapbox that I can get on. And the thing about meeting accessibility in the community, that yes, there can be an element of it's free and you might get what you pay for because it's not intended to be professional treatment. Yet for so many people, it is better than nothing. And we'll talk about some 12-step alternatives here because I think a lot of them are rising up that are striving to meet that same degree of accessibility. But a distinction I make in my work and my book is I do recognize there is a difference between 12-step meetings and treatment centers that were forged in a very 12-step philosophy. Now, if you are working in professional treatment, to me, you have no choice but to be trauma informed. So I get even more enraged when I hear horror stories coming out of treatment centers and professional institutions of how horribly people are treated or how the 12 steps can be used in a very abusive manner. So, I mean, I really do echo what a lot of the critics have said here, that treatment centers should not be just pushing the 12 steps, right? That we ought to be offering other interventions like motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral, DBT, EMDR, the trauma-focused therapies, that there's so much other material we can be giving people that is more professionally validated, right? So while I think 12 steps can have a component at treatment and 12-step meetings can be made available of treatment, if that's all your center is doing, that's not cool. And if your center does not have an understanding about the realities of trauma, that really does need to be addressed. Now, meetings are a whole other story because meetings, and some of you may not even know this background or this history, meetings have never been intended to be professional. Self-help is how they're often described. I think mutual help is a little bit better of a description because it really is about people coming together. The folks who run the meetings are volunteers. I mean, some of us, like Janet was for me, and I will chair meetings occasionally. We're not professionals. I do sponsor 4 women, but I'm not their counselor. So the roles are very different. So it is a total mixed bag of what you can get. The groups are autonomous. It was designed that way to try to keep AA from becoming a total power mongering hierarchy. And that is both the blessing and the curse, in my opinion, of 12-step meetings, which started with AA and then came into other forms of fellowships as well. And what that means is that not all meetings are created equally. I mean, there are some that are so trauma ill-informed, I find them dangerous, and I actively tell my clients to steer clear of them. There are other meetings that are just delightful. I mean, that's why I have kept coming back, right? I have found meetings and groups that have really spoke to my soul over the years. My present 12-step home group, I say, is populated by a bunch of rebel AAs like me who kind of call things out when we need to, and they're like family to me. So I tell clients, and this is some of the guidance I give in the book, because I realize that, again, like we've said, not everybody can afford treatment or continuing care. And I've tried to give in this book a lot of inside secrets where you may be able to afford them in a book, but not necessarily, again, I don't like that it is the way it is, but some of the insider tips I give is don't judge a meeting by just one meeting that you go to. Here are some things to look for. And if you're hearing this kind of language or seeing this kind of behavior, it's probably an unsafe meeting. So consider trying some others. But I tell folks to at least try 6 to 8. And maybe they are in different fellowships, because a lot of individuals do cross-identify. There may be individuals, like when I first came in, I thought drugs were my bigger issue. And then I determined that alcohol was an issue as well. And so AA is where I have primarily found a lot of my recovery. But I also qualify for Al-Anon, and I've gone to Al-Anon over the years, and I've visited some other fellowships over the years. So I really want people to realize that, yes, you can find a lot of help and healing in the 12 steps, but there's a lot of problems out there too. And yes, I would love to see the day where AA and the other fellowships, World Services, like puts out more literature about being trauma informed.
Yeah.
There's been some small movements in those directions about just decorum at meetings, but I really think more has to be done. And since nothing really looks like it's going to be done at a large scale organizational level, part of what we have to leverage here is the autonomous nature of the groups, and really get people in the groups willing to be a trauma advocate, willing to be somebody who calls behaviors out when you see it and is not very helpful. So I've seen a lot of change happen at individual meetings at the grassroots level when we do create more awareness and attention about trauma. Because for instance, at my home group, every time we have a group conscious meeting, we're talking about, are we making this space safe and accessible for people? So that's just some of my feelings on it.
Yeah, you kind of answered. I mean, I wanted to get to, what is your recommendation? So you're kind of saying we each need to be advocates, maybe, since it's not going to come from the top down. And that's part of what makes AA, AA, is that there isn't really a top down, right? And that's why
it's the blessing and the curse, like I said.
Yeah. People are always like, is it a cult though? And
I can answer that question. Some groups are.
Okay.
Or some groups are, or some groups definitely get very cultish in their mentality. I mean, I think part of the fact that AA does allow the groups to be autonomous, like I've said it several times already, it's a blessing and a curse. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons it cannot be seen as cultish, because you're letting groups decide for themselves what is best. Yet when you have issues like sexual assaults that happen at meetings, or just horrible behaviors that like, I would love to see some more action come from the top down, but that just doesn't happen. Yeah. If you're truly interested, the International Cultic Studies Association, they're one of my favorite organizations. I do a lot of citations of their material. They list 13 characteristics of a cult. And to be quite honest, some groups and some sponsors do get that mentality. But I've met many more groups and sponsors that don't. So what I try to tell people, and this is even what the Cult Studies Association will say, is decide for yourself. Look at these characteristics. And if the group you're going to, if the sponsor you're working with feels like they're imparting this kind of cultish mentality on you, go the other way. Find another group.
Yeah, absolutely. I always tend to tell people that it's not a cult, because typically in a cult, you have someone at the top who's in charge, who wants all the power, and they also want your money. And that's not really how the meetings and groups work. But I see there's other components, you know, in terms of kind of the brainwashing, and there's other ways to get power.
Like, for instance, a lot of people will hold up Bill Wilson's teaching as gospel truth, where Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA, was a very flawed man, right? And something, when I explain trauma in the 12 steps to a lot of what we generally call old timers, or people who've been around a while, who think like, you know, everything you need is in the book and Bill's a saint. I tell them we have learned a lot more about trauma and the brain since 1935. And I think Bill would be on board with that, because even the 12-step text is so clear that we've learned a lot from the fields of medicine and psychiatry, and we should seek that outside help when it's available and when we need it.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to, I'm like, I could talk to you about every single one of these things for like an hour. So I'm just going to keep moving.
Sure.
But I wanted to ask Carrie to share. So Carrie, you know, Carrie and I talk about 12-step meetings a lot because we're both on the this path together. And I'm just so grateful that you're here, Carrie, to share some of your story with the ACEs Connection community. So yeah, please do.
Well, I just think it's very interesting, and Jamie probably knows a lot more about this than I do, but that Bill Wilson apparently was born into tremendous trauma. Mm-hmm. He had a history of trauma, of loss. I mean, I've heard stories that he was born behind a bar. His mother abandoned him several times to become a physician herself. Mm-hmm. He was left with grandparents. He fell madly in love with a woman who, when he was very young, and she died suddenly. And so, you know, here's a man who's experienced loss after loss after loss. And I think that I wish that more would be known about that, how many ACEs Bill Wilson had. But I've been in recovery for 26 years and have studied it intensely, got a hold of was sent the ACEs study by my sponsor. No, not by my sponsor, but by a mentor in the year 2000. And Jimmy, I don't know about you, but when I read it and counted up how many ACEs I had, I took that ACEs study and I shoved it in a drawer. I cried because I had 2 little kids, and I said, oh my God, I'm not going to live long enough to take care of them. Mm-hmm. But I was deep into recovery, thank God, and working on a book about it. The best tips and tools I had learned as a single mother, because we needed to reparent ourselves. I needed to be reparented, and that's what I love about your story, about your sponsor, who actually took you home and put you to bed and gave you a cold compress, because we needed some mothering, for crying out loud. We needed some mothering. My mother was, anyway. But when I go into 12-step meetings, and I've done this for years, sometimes I ask people to close their eyes, and I ask, you know, and say, I'm the only person who's going to see this, but how many of you grew up in an alcoholic home? How many people grew up with stress and experiencing domestic violence, And I mean, the arms just, and when I tie trauma and addiction together, the relief that I see in people who are really listening, and most of the time, that's the beauty of AA and 12 steps, is that we learn how to listen better, I think, in those meetings. And I know for me, there's some meetings that could be dysregulating, but for me, the meetings were incredibly regulating to sit down, be with a group of people. You kind of had communion in those cheap ass cookies and that nasty coffee, which I gave up that stuff because that did not serve me well. But anyway, it was communion of sorts, and being enveloped in that. And women's meetings to me were very dear. I love that, you know, men sponsor men, women sponsor women, but that there were specifically women's meetings, because I think
your audio is going out a little bit, Carrie. You're getting quiet.
Sorry, there's a lot of counseling there. I'll just jump off, but that's what I wanted to put out there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Jamie, do you have a response? And then we might ask some other people to share.
Yeah, I think something I would encourage people to consider about what A gave us as a field, whether or not you like AA or not. I mean, you may be on this call thinking it's a crock of BS and it has no place for in work with trauma. But the thing that AA really taught us, and I hope everybody can draw from this, is the potency of one individual who's struggling helping another. If you don't know much about the founding of AA, Bill Wilson, who we've been talking about, he had 5 months sober, mostly dry, was not really working on himself or his emotions after years of, as Carrie mentioned, trauma and struggling to try to get sober. And he was initially introduced to more of a religious organization called the Oxford Groups that shared with him this idea that if you can carry the message, if you can share with someone else who may be struggling, that may help to keep you sober. And it did for 5 months. Nobody he reached out to in New York ever stayed sober, but he did. And so when he was on a business trip in Akron, Ohio, which is not very far from where I am, he was struggling and feeling tempted because it was a chance to try to get his career back as a stockbroker. And the bar was just calling to him, and he found a telephone in the lobby and just started calling churches saying, I need to talk to another alcoholic. And a lot of the people who answered thought he was nuts and just hung up on him, but eventually he found a connection and then ended up meeting Dr. Bob Smith, who was a surgeon that had lost his practice. And the two of them just talked for hours that first day. And, you know, Bob was suspicious at first, thinking that Bill was some kind of an evangelist. And it was just this idea of one person helping another. So from there is where the program grew. And whether or not you like the steps, whether or not you like kind of what the program has become, I would ask you to consider that healing power of human connection that the two of them tapped into, and it helped them to stay sober up until their natural deaths. And for a lot of us, that what has really been what has done it, that yes, we can have connection with a professional. And even in professionals that I train, I will share this story to highlight just how much healing empathy can bring, especially at the limbic level of our brains. But that there's something very magical about other people who are struggling be able to walk each other home, using the words of Ram Dass, being able to connect with each other in that very human way. And so whether or not you like the steps themselves or the program themselves, I think that is the big learning of what AA gave us as a field, and what AA, the origin story, can give us as humans trying to help each other walk each other home, right? You're muted again, dear. Sorry.
Thanks. Thank you all for all the great comments that I see in the chat. Jenna, who should we hear from?
I was thinking of calling on Brooklyn Alvarez. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you put a couple great questions in the chat that I think would be interesting to have some answers for.
Yeah, sure. So hold on, I actually lost my questions in the chat. Okay, so I'm sort of just wondering about your different professional roles. So right now I'm training, I'm in the process of getting my doctorate and in clinical psychology. So I'm in the middle of all of that. And I'm just wondering, the first question I had was, how do you differentiate between your professional roles in different settings? So like, how do you know where that line is when you're sponsoring somebody versus when you're in more of a clinical position?
Sure. It's an excellent question. So I can speak from my experience, strength, and hope. I mean, what may work for me may not work for you in this situation. I mean, as a professional, I have always chosen to be pretty out about my recovery. I have learned, and I believe there's a lot that when I'm working with others I counsel or others I serve professionally, that, I never want to make it about me, but I'm only going to talk about my recovery if I feel it would be a benefit to the people that I serve. And then obviously as a teacher, I never mind talking about it, because it's just something that has, I think what recovery taught me is the importance of living a life of rigorous honesty, living a life of authenticity. And every year of my sobriety, I've gotten more and more stepped into that. So I've never been, hidden in my professional role as someone in recovery. And of course, a lot of my colleagues have chided me for that. A lot of people aren't comfortable with it, but even on the mental health end, a lot of what I've worked and advocated for is that that's part of the problem, is this like
Right.
us versus them type of divide in the field. And I do encourage professionals to be out, whether it's about your addiction, your mental health issue, truly if you've worked on the stuff and if you are comfortable being out. I never want to peer pressure people to come out either. Yet I think so many of my colleagues in the field have been like ashamed to talk about the things that plague them. And I mean, I've also gotten feedback from people who say like, thank you just for being open, because there's also the mental health struggles of my story too, which we haven't gotten into. Now, in terms of that line between sponsorship and counseling, I mean, what's interesting is, so for those of you not familiar, the term sponsor in AA basically means a mentor. It's a non-professional relationship. It is somebody who mentors you through the steps. And for a lot of years, I chose not to sponsor because it felt a little too much like work. And I had this, I don't know if I can sponsor effectively because I'm such a natural counselor that I don't want to cross the lines, right? I do think, though, in later years of recovery, and I write about this in the new book, I did come out of retirement as a sponsor. And I now sponsor 4 women, and I have all sent them off to see their own counselor. So they all have their own counselors, right, that they work with. And my role as their sponsor is, I mean, another premise of 12 step is that the purpose of the 12 step and sharing the message is really to help you, the one who's sharing it. So inevitably, every time I'm talking to one of these young women, I feel this sense of, wow, I'm telling them what I need to hear for myself. And it helps me more than anything. And one of the reasons I also decided to come out of retirement as a sponsor is here I am writing and teaching about how we need trauma-informed sponsorship. And all 4 of the women who I now sponsor struggled with finding somebody who is truly trauma-informed to sponsor them. So yeah, I have an amazing sponsor who was also a professional clinical social worker before he retired. And yeah, it's been the most healing relationship I've had in my life. He's an older man. And I know the comment was made earlier that traditionally in recovery, women sponsor women, men sponsor men. I do think when LGBT factors are involved, it's not necessarily that need of a distinction. So I'm a bisexual woman, he's a gay man. And one of the reasons I asked him to sponsor me is that, yes, he's been in recovery 30 some years, but he and his husband have also been out in the state of Ohio for 56 years. And I want what they have, because we say it's often recommended you pick a sponsor who really has what you want in life. And I want to be that authentic and that comfortable with myself and my path. So I think the sponsorship path is so important. The professional path is so important. And having walked both of them, I just really try to stay very clear about what my intentions are in both roles.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
So much.
Thank you. Great question.
Great question. Jenna, who else do we have? I know we have so many great comments.
So many comments. I wanted to see if Rhonda would like to be unmuted to share what she had to say. Let me see.
Sure, but I have to find it.
We hear you.
Where is it there? Okay, yeah, here it is. Yeah, for the past 10 years, I've worked as a contract mental health. I'm an LCSW and an LCADC in a long-term residential treatment center for women in Kentucky. And all of my clients are no-income clients. The program lasts, they say 6 months sometimes, but it's never 6 months. It's like a year to 18 months. And I have really come to love the 12 steps. I myself am not in recovery. I tell my clients that I tried really hard, but it didn't work for me. the AA, I mean, I wasn't an alcoholic. I would have come by it very honestly from both sides of my family. I have seen, since I've worked there and gotten very familiar with the 12 steps and seen how it has created a really, really strong foundation for people to stand on and then move forward in their lives. It's incredible. What I have seen too is that because people aren't informed about trauma and how it affects individuals in their lives, like staff and the residents themselves will tend to blame the victim because they're not changing from the 12, they're not changing using the 12 steps. And sometimes it just takes more. They have been really kind enough to give me the opportunity to be there. And so I see a large number of people, and 99% of them have trauma in there. Right now I'm working with the director there to take the trauma-informed care training that I learned with another colleague who's on this call too, into the treatment center and train the staff and some of the mentors there. This is a peer support program. It's a recovery dynamics. So Jamie, I love you. I've seen you several times in person, and I've got your books, and thank you so much for the work you do.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being that advocate in your center. That's so important.
Yeah, it's really inspiring to hear that, Rhonda. And I really appreciate, I'm really glad that we called on you, because a little bit of reading your book, Jamie, is feeling like, oh my gosh, is this all futile? Like I have a close family member who has been in recovery very actively the last few years and has really struggled. And I've gotten to see that treatment centers are not doing too much to provide counseling. And so hearing Rhonda say, I am working on a solution, I am going to make treatment trauma-informed, is just, I just am like, okay, someone's doing it.
Yes. And I think one of the problems with the addiction treatment field specifically, but to be fair, I see it in the mental health field too, that there can be this hesitancy to work with trauma because we've not worked on our own trauma as providers, that we're scared to death of it. And a story that I tell in the book intones one of my role models, Stephanie Covington, and she wrote A Woman's Way Through the 12 Steps and was one of the initial very big leaders in getting women-specific, gender-specific, gender-responsive programming. And I heard her keynote. It was between when I wrote the two books, and so this version's in the new book. And she was keynoting about being in the early 80s and speaking about sex, trauma, and violence at an addiction conference one year. And she said after the conference, her colleagues came up to her and they were ready to tear her head off, saying, you can't be talking about trauma and treatment. Our people aren't ready for that. Our people aren't ready for it. And she said that she heard such vitriol in their voices and such resistance and such hesitancy. It was clear they were saying, we're not ready to deal with it because we've not addressed it ourselves. And yeah, I just feel that if you are working in this field, or if you are more of a community-based person, if you are working as a sponsor or peer support, don't underestimate the importance of you doing your own trauma work as a big part of the solution too. Yeah. Because that is going to come through in how you relate to people and how you talk to people. And just those simple little measures of empathy that go a long way that are missing when people haven't touched this work themselves.
That brings up so much. So, you know, I mean, at the end of your book, you kind of talk about love being the thing that needs to carry us and our society, and in meetings. And it made me think of so much, just like, for example, and I talk about this a lot in my own work, that the contempt for life existing in the household I was raised in was due a lot to factors beyond my family's control, like socioeconomic factors. I have a grandparent who was raised on a Native American reservation, so there was a lot of trauma that is historical trauma. So, and we're dealing with this, especially in the United States, where there's all these factors that create homes that have toxic levels of stress. And so, but the end result was that I ended up growing up in a home where there wasn't this general feeling of love and warmth towards life. And I really think in my mind, that can be like the number one trauma. It's like, were you raised in a home that said, life is beautiful, life is a gift, I'm going to spread love? Or were you raised in a home where it was like, this is really stressful and you're bugging me and you're annoying me and get out of here and I cannot even with you? Like, which type of environment did you get? And then I see that in the rooms as well, you know, at meetings, is sort of like, what type of energy are we cultivating?
Yep.
Is this a meeting where love is prevailing and we're seeing people for who they are and we're meeting people where they're at? Or is this fear and contempt?
Right. Very well put. Very well put. As you were talking, I thought of a point I make in the book, which is the very apt slogan, don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, are the 3 unwritten rules of the alcoholic home or the dysfunctional home. Mm-hmm. And it was something I learned from Janet in AA, but it's commonly used in Al-Anon. So think about that. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. If those were the 3 kind of unwritten, unspoken rules of a home environment or of a culture, of a government, of name it, you know, whatever societal influences, all 3 of those conditions get in the way of trauma being healed, trauma being processed as it happens. And so I rail in meetings and in treatment where I see people being shut down, because to me, you're just recapitulating that same ethic of, you know, no, what you have to say isn't important. Just sit here, shut up, deal with it. You know, learn the skills, learn the tools, work the steps, but we don't want to hear about this other stuff that happened to you. And I do justifiably get where a lot of treatment centers feel overwhelmed. I remember getting a message from somebody I like and admire very much in the program, who is working as a social worker at a very run-of-the-mill treatment, right? And she, you know, she has this heart to want to be there doing trauma work, but she's like, you know, we just don't have the time. They don't give us the time. They don't give us the resources. They don't give us the space to work with people on an individual level. So I think that frustration can be very systemic, where you might have good professionals who want to make a difference, but feel that they're running up against these barriers, these barriers. And so to her, I would say, don't doubt that the way you interact with people is going to plant seeds. And don't doubt that the way you are able to validate and empathize, like, hey, I hear this happened to you. I hear this is part of your story. Unfortunately, we may not have the time to get into all of it here at this level of treatment, but I'm hoping we can come up with a plan to help you to deal with it after you leave. And thank you to the person who wrote in chat. I did happen to catch it. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel is typically attributed to Claudia Black, who was another great mother of the field. But it really has trickled into, you know, a lot of 12-step parlance as well. So thank you for pointing that out, whoever commented.
Jamie, I just wanted to say, and then Jenna has a question. I have so many notes from your book, like pages and pages.
That makes an awesome.
I just loved everything. And so I was just like, yes. Like just so much. You just nailed it. Every single thought or complaint or interesting thing I've ever thought about 12-step meetings is you all need to get this book. No. I can tell that you all are very interested based on the comments, and it's an amazing book. And
yeah, and just I want to note, and then I want to get to Jenna's question, because I've been kind of glancing at the chat because I'm speaking, I'm not looking at it in any great detail. But I've heard people say things like, I have a problem with this step, this language and this step. That's a big part of what I get into in this book, that a lot of what the answer is change up the language. Change up the language. Like, for instance, character defects, which is one of my big problem phrases in the steps, you can change to negative coping skills. They do that in Workaholics Anonymous. They downright say, if character defects doesn't work for you. So to me, a big part of being trauma informed, and I think, ACEs folks would know this, is how you language things. And to realize that giving people openness to modify language, which I'm on board with, is a big part of how we do make this trauma informed.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I had wanted to say that one thing I wrote down and underlined multiple times was this idea that I see echoing throughout your book of the importance of validating first.
Yeah.
And that maybe isn't happening enough. And I actually, we don't even have time to get in there, but I just wanted to say, because I keep hearing you kind of say it in our discussion as well, is the importance of meeting people where they're at and seeing them and helping them feel heard before you just throw slogans at them or teachings. Is sort of like, let me validate your experience. And I almost just felt like, God, if that one thing could happen in, in every room, in every discussion, every room, that would make a huge change. And I really appreciate that point you make throughout your book.
That is the theme of the book. So I'm glad you picked up on it, that you have to validate before you challenge. That challenging can be a part of getting well, to be clear. But if you challenge a person before they feel validated and heard and received, you're doing it in the wrong order. And that's where a lot of 12-steppers go wrong. And I'll always remember the piece of wisdom Janet gave me that changed my life. She said, Jamie, after everything you've been through, it's no wonder you became alcoholic. So what are you going to do about it now? Because if she had left it at just that first part, it would have been the whole, okay, almost like self-pity, right? Like, of course, all these things happen to you because you were traumatized. But then she gave me, here's what we do about it. So validate and then challenge.
Yeah, it's both. Jenna?
Jamie, you mentioned at the beginning that you talk about some alternatives to the 12-step program. Would you mind sharing those with us?
Yeah, I definitely don't mind sharing. I mean, some of the more, probably the most popular one that I like the most is Smart Recovery. So Smart Recovery is very cognitively, behaviorally based, but it is a good fit for people who don't really want the spiritual languaging. So I do like Smart Recovery. There's also Life Ring Sobriety, Women in Recovery, or Women for Sobriety and Men for Sobriety, that are also 12-step alternatives that are pretty well known. There's also a big Buddhist recovery movement now that has really taken root. Refuge recovery was kind of the original one that was popular, although I just wrote in another thing I'm working on, Buddhist recovery didn't start with refuge recovery. It just is what made it popular. And then there's Recovery Dharma, which has now been an offspring, because refuge recovery justifiably ran into some problems related to a scandal, but I do think that a lot of the material of refuge recovery is still right on point. So people who may find the 12 steps to be a little too Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic in their influence might like the Buddhist recovery. And the other thing is, don't be afraid. And then there's people on the other end who don't find the 12 steps Christian enough. So Celebrate Recovery might be a better fit for you. I always say, don't be afraid to Google, like pagans in recovery, however you may identify in recovery, and something may come up in your area. Yeah. Or now in the COVID era, you might be able to connect with folks online. So for instance, in my area here in the Youngstown, Warren, Ohio area, we have our own meditation recovery meeting that meets on Thursday nights. We are not 12-step affiliated in any way. I mean, most of us are 12-steppers who come to the meeting, but I lead that meeting along with my sponsor because we're meditation and yoga teachers. And our recovery meeting has a focus that's more meditation and yoga related. So yeah, if you follow my Facebook page, Mindful Ohio and the Institute for Creative Mindfulness, I know it's a mouthful. If you want to put that in chat, Jenna, it's Mindful Ohio and the Institute for Creative Mindfulness. It's the pinned post there about our Thursday night meeting. If anybody may want to join us, it's public welcome. We also do a yoga recovery meeting in our area. And then there's yoga of 12-step recovery, recovery yoga. There's a lot of different recovery yoga programs that are out there now. So I always say Google's your best friend in this area. Let me go ahead, put it in chat, because yeah, it's specifically on Facebook, not the main. Oh yeah, you put that there, Jenna. Mindful Ohio.
She got it. She got it.
Yep, I got it. Yeah. So yeah, those are my kind of best tips in terms of 12-step alternatives. I mean, there are others out there, but what I like to say is when you're searching for a program, if something markets themselves as so anti-12-step, I get a little concerned that they're kind of promoting it more from this place of vitriol about why they're not 12 steps, as opposed to something like Smart Recovery, which is, hey, just here's a different offering.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Totally. Wow. Well, this hour flew by. Jamie, it's been such an honor to have your wisdom shared with our community. You know, the wonderful thing about these A Better Normal discussions is that when we all come here together and we're all having a discussion, you know, in the chat, over video, is that we're creating right now in this space, and then we will take these teachings out, you know, into our communities, but we're creating the trauma-informed society that we really know is going to be the most powerful. Like we know this is the way forward to create the kind of society that we want to live in. And I cannot thank you enough, both for your amazing book, and all the amazing teachings that have really, really sparked the way that I look at recovery and what could happen moving forward. I know that based on the comments, you've had that impact on many attendees today. So thank you so much for your book. Thank you for your time and sharing your teachings here with our community. Just thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my great pleasure. And I hope to do it again sometime.
Great. Jenna, thank you so much for facilitating and responding to everyone's questions and comments in the chats and dropping in all those great resources. I just want all of you who attended, and thank you all so much for creating a trauma-informed society with us. I want you all to know that before we close out this meeting, you can click on the 3 dots in the chat and click Save Chat if you want to come back to the resources. It's such an easy way to do that. Jenna, will you let people know where they can find the recording?
Absolutely. So it will be posted on our YouTube channel later today, and you can find the link to our YouTube either just by searching ACES Connection or going through the ACES Connection website.
And what do we have coming up?
Coming up next week, we just have 1 episode on our Education Upended series. We also had a great episode yesterday of our Education Upended series on listening, which you can find on our YouTube channel, all about what listening really means.
Great. And we will be taking a break from A Better Normal the week after next. And then we're so excited to come back with a whole bunch of new content. So thank you so much. Thank you, Carrie, for joining. And thank you for all of you who shared, and even those who just created the space with us. Even if you didn't share, it really makes a difference for it to have you all be here. So just filled with so much gratitude, and I hope that you all have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.